Hello, everybody. This is week 2 review. Go over a little bit of business. Go over the what we covered in week 2. Some of the highlights, not necessarily everything, but some of the highlights. Also, about this review, I'm going to go over some things that I wish we would have done in week 2. Some of the stuff I had at the end of the PowerPoint that I didn't finish going over today, which is Friday, the 17th of January. I'm going to go over, I guess, a little bit of that on Wednesday. Not all of it, and I'll blow through the stuff I do go over, hopefully super quickly. What I am going to do is I'm going to send you an email in a few minutes with the, what I was looking for, what I was getting at with some of, the amendments, and clauses and those stuff that I pulled out for the week 2 slideshow, which when you open it up you'll see it, and I'll actually be going through those parts. So if you open up the week 2 slideshow, when I get to that area, you can follow along if you want to. One note, I am just going to do this without going back and redoing it in case it gets super awkward, because I have a lot of stuff to do, a lot of cleaning and things for visitors coming into town for this whole weekend, and I want to get this out to you sooner rather than later. So yeah, some business. No class Monday. That's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Attendance. That is, starting and counting now. If you get 3 free absences, just repeating some policy stuff, 3 free absences. After that, on your 4th absence, it's 2 points off your final grade. So if you have a 90 and you have a 4th absence, that's 2 points off your grade, which is an 88. However, I'm giving you the option of doing up to 3 makeup assignments to make up the 4th, 5th, and 6th absence. So theoretically, if you do those makeup assignments, it won't be until your 7th absence that you get taken off for your class average. So just keep that in mind. Those absences are there for you to use when you get sick, when you can't start your car in the morning. Maybe one you use when you feel lazy. But when something big does happen, that's most of what those absences are there for. That's what those absences are there for. So just keep that in mind if you've missed a lot of class and something major does happen. I'm not necessarily going to be totally able to work with you, so I hope that makes sense. Keep it in your head. Another thing, it is never ever too early to start asking me questions or talking to me about any of the assignments or projects coming up. So you have the personal ideology paper, which we'll go over as some on Wednesday, a lot on Wednesday, and it's due the following Monday, the 27th. So you have 10 days from now or so. I have a calendar over there, which is why I look. So for this paper, though, keep in mind there's no sourcing. You don't need to do any sourcing because all of this should be coming out of your own head. You're going to be wanting to think critically about what you believe and why. So you can start from general principles that you hold, and how you feel like maybe those general principles are enacted in the real world, like what real policy stuff does that entail. So if you believe in human dignity, that's like a general political value that you have. What does that mean? What does it mean to have human dignity? How would you protect or enact, I guess, human dignity? If you believe in a right to education, what does that mean? What does it mean when you believe in a right to a public education? And what ideologies support that, or what assumptions are you using to support that position? So think about that. If you have any questions about maybe what you believe, I can tell you what you believe. Just kidding. I can help you understand a little more about what your maybe what you'll be looking for, or what you want to think about if you give me some ideas of what you are thinking about. You can turn in rough drafts for this paper also. Anything that's you need to do, excuse me, you can turn in a rough draft to me. You can turn in a paragraph. You can turn in 3 sentences of a rough idea, and I'll respond to what you have and sort of help getting you on the right path. Never ever feel afraid or hesitant to come to me with any amount of work you have and any amount of questions you have, so I can help you. I mean, let me help you. Please let me help you. I'll get on my knees and beg. Just ask me questions, so I don't have to read papers that I have to give bad grades to, because that makes me sad. Okay, so I think that's that. I have all my notes on my computer, so let me just make sure. Oh, State Union to 28th Tuesday. That's a big deal. And by Wednesday of next week, you'll want to have responded to other people's constitutional amendment, what they like and didn't like. Respond to at least one. I think everybody probably should respond to 2. And if you respond to somebody's question and they respond to you, maybe you need to respond back to them, or somebody asks you a question and you respond to that question. You probably should respond to that question, but that won't necessarily count as a response. I mean, don't think it's one response and that's it. Try and, don't spend your whole day on it, obviously, but basically just try not to do the bare minimum amount of work. That would be good for your participation grade, and it's 20% grade, things like that. So, and it'll be very good for testing and stuff like that. One other thing, I guess, is everything we go over in class is fair game for tests. So if we ever talk about anything, it could be on a final exam. Okay, so week 2, sorry. Monday on week 2, we went over some of the political landscape stuff that exists today. So we went over what Democrats and Republicans were. Democrats are considered a liberal party, or the party of the left. Republicans are considered a conservative party, or the party on the right. We live in a country where there generally is just 2 parties. There are these minor third parties that pretty much don't do too much. America is very segregated. It's racially very segregated still today. There'll be some examples of that in the second half of the semester, but it's also politically very segregated. We've become increasingly politically segregated, with the urban areas increasingly concentratedly more liberal, and suburban and rural areas increasingly more conservative. If you look on the PowerPoint slides for the week 1, there's the election maps and the county level maps, where you can see how most of the map is made up by red. There is blue on there, but most of the map is made up of red, and yet that map does not represent that Republicans, which are the red team on the map, won a majority. It represents that the blue team, the Democrats, won the majority. And the reason why that can be the case is because those blue dots generally represent much higher population areas with higher population centers versus all the red areas. I think a lot of the stuff about Democrats and Republicans you can read on the slide. Current issues just decide to be some, facts, things to keep in mind, especially for the current issues current event paper, and you should be reading articles every now and then, like newspaper articles. Like, do a Google search and type in Syria, and then click on the news thing of that. Maybe I'll show how to do that in class. And just read one of the things on there occasionally. that will help you with the current event assignments, within class participation, and will help you with the legislative proposal at the end. You must, if the legislative proposal, you're going to become an expert on a policy area. So you're going to want to start sort of getting an idea of what policy things are out there today, like now, so you can have a better idea of what you want to do in the future. So, okay, let's just go to the week 2 slides. Founding of the nation, we originally had the Articles of Confederation, just some highlights. We scrapped those because it was too decentralized, and we moved to the Constitution. The debate surrounding the Constitution and the Articles and everything, basically, very, very contentious. I hammer this point home because a lot of pundits, people in the media, etc., often try to claim the founders as supporting their ideas. One, as if that's a good thing. Because I don't necessarily know if it is. But the idea is it gives their argument more weight. Like, if Thomas Jefferson thought this, and if all the founding fathers thought this, then it must be a good idea. And that's why you should adopt my policy position. One, not all the founders believe the same things. Even the people that were intimately involved in creating the Constitution, there were, as I said, fierce debates, name-calling, bitterness. A sitting vice president later shot one of the founders and killed him over disagreements that began at this point. Friendships were lost. Time that they could never get back. So sad. So it's also good to think about that, to remember that sort of like partisan bickering and name calling, stuff like that, did not exist today. If you look back in time, people have always bemoaned how terrible like the partisanship is and how terrible the name calling is in Washington and stuff like that at that day, and how in the past it used to be so much better and we could get along and blah blah blah. That's not necessarily accurate. I would say the difference between like today's quote unquote partisanship and 1790s partisanship is that in 1790, the people, the politicians, founders, whatever, felt the stakes were a lot higher than they are today. And so not doing something was so much worse and scarier to everybody than today it is for people not to do something. And that's why today we perhaps have more gridlock, and back in the day, there was a little more movement in Congress, movement in creating the country even, because it's not like either sides necessarily wanted to compromise with each other, and it's not like neither side called each other the equivalent of Nazis and stuff back in the day, but the alternatives everybody felt were just so much worse, that, as I said, one of the sides, they swallowed that bitter pill. The people that made up the revolutionaries, at least the founding fathers, those members of the revolutionists, were generally elites within the colonies, rich white men who had things to lose, and they set up the Constitution to have that stronger central government to make up for the failures of the Articles of Confederation in terms of like protection and making the states get along with each other, and being able to present one face of America to the rest of the world. instead of 13 different faces. There's one point, I can't remember which politician it was, under the Articles of Confederation, was talking with the French ambassador or something. And the French ambassador asked him, well, when I make this treaty, am I making it with, let's say the guy was from Massachusetts, am I making it with Massachusetts or with America? The idea being the people that were sent overseas, there was no guarantee that all the other states would agree to what one person negotiated. And so that caused a lot of problems. And there's that pesky problem of democracy causing poor people to have access to power, and then those poor and middle class people wanting to live where they weren't hungry all the time. So that sucked for them. So the minority that we're talking about when we're talking about the tyranny of the majority over the minority, it's the tyranny of literally most of the people, of the middle class, of the lower class, against the minority, the upper class. It was as much an economic revolution as it was an idealistic revolution. Slavery was a big deal in the Constitution. That threatened to destroy the Union a couple times before it even started. But they came up with the 3/5 compromise, in which slaves were counted as, one slave was counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation in the House. There was also the Great Compromise, which was the creation of both the House and the Senate. The states with smaller populations wanted in the national legislature 1 vote per state or 2 votes per state. The larger states, or the states with the larger amount of people in them, wanted each state to be represented in the legislature based upon the population that was in the state. That obviously would create some tension, because we're talking about a state's political power, and generally states with less people in them make up a larger number of the states, even though they make up a smaller number of the people. So the idea is, if we have a legislature that happens, a few people have much more power relative to others. So they bicameraled that legislature and made the House and the Senate 1 for each, and then they would have to compromise together. Let's look at the what slide? Where are we? 22. On the week 2 articles 4 through 7. That's things where you find the full faith and credit clause, privileges and immunities clause, supremacy clause, information on how states are made, and the idea that there should be no religious test for office. So full faith and credit clause, the money of the United States is valid. It's good. Sorry, I want to make sure I get the exact right info for you. This is that awkwardness I was talking about. Another thing we went over while I'm getting this was the unemployment. Remember this for the final exam. We have to have 150,000 new jobs created every month in order to simply keep up with population growth. If 140,000 jobs are created, then that means that 10,000 people are now without a job, theoretically at least. So, and remember about when the what the unemployment fell to, 6.7%, but what exactly that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that a bunch more people have jobs, it just means a lot of people left the job market, and that's sad. So, okay, yeah. So the full faith and credit clause, rulings in states are valid in every other state. Basically, the money is later. The full faith and credit clause basically, each state has to respect every other state in terms of their jurisdictions and things like that. Now, the privileges and immunities clause, which is the other one, is kind of like the reverse of that, where each citizen is entitled to the, as it says, privileges and immunities of citizens of several states. So, what are the rights for a citizen in one state can't not be the rights for citizens in other states that, so a bit of that is if I take my North Carolina driver's license to Virginia, Virginia is like, hey, yeah, you can still drive here. So that's a bit of that. And the other bit of it is the citizens have to be treated equally throughout the states. Even if they're in another state, they're still a resident of one state, but they're in another state, and the federal government should treat them equally. Can't, say one state sucks and treat their citizens badly. Okay, so that sadness happened. What's week 2? Okay. Supremacy clause, basically the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. You have the state governments, but if the state constitution, state governments conflict with the federal constitution wins out every single time, no exceptions. That's what that means. In those articles, there's also how states are made. It's like 60,000 people in your state, and then you get to vote to become a state, and Congress has to accept you. The other important part of that is that there shall be, according to the federal constitution, no religious tests for the oath of office. Okay, so we have the amendments. Here's the amendment process. This confuses a lot of people. So amendments are made to the Constitution because times change and people want different rights. They want to make things explicit in the Constitution, and that's why we have amendments. So, 2 ways to make amendments. One, an amendment is proposed to Congress. Once that amendment is proposed to Congress, it has to step on the cord. It has to pass 2/3, or it has to have a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. So 66.666666, etc. % of the Senate members and of the House members have to vote to say, yes, this is a good constitutional amendment, we're going to pass it. Then that amendment goes to the states. The states can decide how they want to ratify an amendment. It's usually the state legislatures that vote to ratify an amendment to say, yes, we agree with this amendment. But sometimes the states can call a constitutional convention and have the people elect special delegates to debate that amendment and decide if the state's going to ratify it or not. Basically, whichever way the states choose, if then 3/4 of the states agree that the amendment is a good idea, it becomes a part of the Constitution. So that's 3/4 is 38 out of 50 of the states have to agree that an amendment is a good idea for it to be added to the Constitution. So 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate have to vote on it and say, yes, this is a good thing to put in the Constitution. And then 38 of the 50, or 3/4 of all of the states, of all the 50 states, have to say, we also agree with this amendment, and then it can go into the Constitution. The other way, that's never been done before, for some reasons I'll tell you why, is a constitutional convention can be called. A constitutional convention can be called if 2/3 of the states say that there should be one. Once a constitutional convention is called, basically it's a free-for-all on the Constitution. Anything by anybody can be proposed or, proposed to be added or proposed to be taken away from the Constitution. Now, within that convention, on things that are proposed, again, 75% of the states, 38 out of 50, have to agree that it's a good thing to put in the Constitution. But instead of it being issue specific, like this is the one amendment we're here to talk about, anything can be talked about in the Constitutional Convention. So people don't normally, or have never, done amendments in that way because of the amount of uncertainty that gets involved with what's going to happen, the fact that the focus can be taken away from the real thing, the real amendment that people want to get passed. Let's say we create a convention to provide equal rights to women, which is still not in the Constitution. When we get there, then anybody can propose anything, and the convention could be, depending on how you look at, quote unquote, hijacked by other people with an agenda, and they could start pushing a different issue than the thing that people originally sort of organized it to do, the Equal Rights Amendment. They could use it to push gay marriage or abortion, one way or the other. They could say citizens have the right to own guns for personal protection reasons, not for militia reasons, and that includes handguns and shotguns and tanks. People can have tanks. So yeah. So that's why that amendment process doesn't happen. So the big amendments, I divided them into 4 sections, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get to. So the first ones that I want to make sure everybody's aware of are in the Bill of Rights, 1, 2, 4, and 8. 1 is the freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition government, and freedom of religion, quote unquote, freedom of religion. So free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, the freedom to gather in large numbers and do protests and rallies, the freedom to petition the government, to provide a list of grievances, or to try and get an issue put on the government agenda, have a bunch of people sign the petition, and then the government has to either respond to it, or in a lot of local areas, if you petition the government to have speed bumps put on your local road, then the government has to put speed bumps on your road. That's part of the petition process if that right has been granted in that way. Now, the religion thing is Congress cannot establish a religion, which is tricky in a lot of ways, and it's been subject to a lot of debate as to exactly what it means. And it's debate that has been going on for a very long time, and it's not going to end anytime soon. Something that would be probably interesting to talk about, what people think it means and what the different implications are of our beliefs on what that means. And what role do you think government should have in religion? I think it's interesting and something I may bring up very soon. Anyway. Second Amendment's the gun rights one. The First and Second Amendments, if somebody says they like the Second Amendment more than the First Amendment, that means they like guns more than speech, supposedly, quote unquote. And they're probably Republican. If somebody says they like the First Amendment more than the Second Amendment, then they're probably Democrat. That's a very crude litmus test, if you want to use that for whatever reason. Now, the Second Amendment talks about the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed because it's needed to protect to have a militia. Let's see. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. super debatable what that means. Certainly, we can look at historical context and see what a sort of majority opinion of what that meant was at the time. What the majority of people or what the courts were thinking that meant in the 1780s or 1790s and 1800s and 1810s through about 1900. How that amendment would be viewed, and gun rights advocates, you are actually not going to like the answer to that. What the courts interpreted that to mean and what that means to laws regarding gun ownership and what guns people can own and things like that. Second Amendment, folks, you're going to be very, very disappointed if you look at that. However, as I've been saying, hopefully, it doesn't. In some ways, it doesn't matter what people thought way back in the day. What worked for back in the day doesn't necessarily work for today's society, and that's part of the reason the founders created a constitution that could be amended and could be interpreted in different ways. That and political expediency, but these words have the meaning that we give to them, and we can give them the meanings that we want to. And as society changes and the meanings of words change, what these things mean are going to change. So while, like I said, the original intent of the Constitution would not necessarily be very supportive of what current Second Amendment right advocates would like the NRA, for example, way missing the point. There is no reason to think that is the trump card that wins the argument. The argument should rest on the merits of, what works good for society. At least that's my assumption. Not based upon what Thomas Jefferson thought in, 1790. That's dumb. Sorry, I don't think any of y'all are dumb if y'all think that. That's my little soapbox on the Second Amendment. Fourth Amendment's the right to not have unreasonable searches and seizures on your property. Police have to get a warrant, things like that. The Fourth Amendment is where we also now get the right to privacy. We'll be reading a court case or two where we see how that right to privacy evolved and why it evolved, even though it's not in the Constitution. Modern day courts have said, hey, that unwarranted search and seizure thing, the intent behind that is also privacy. That's kind of like the underlying idea behind what that is. So let's just go and make it explicit. People have a right to privacy. The Eighth Amendment is the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. That's a big deal with how we treat prisoners, the death penalty, things like that. Those are the Bill of Rights. Those were 1791. So aside from the First and Second Amendment, I don't necessarily, when we go through these other amendments also, I don't necessarily expect you to know what each amendment was. So I don't expect you to say, oh, the right to need a warrant to have the government search your property, that's the Fourth Amendment. I don't necessarily expect you to be able to pop that out. I do expect you to say, the right to privacy, or privacy, the right to have protection of your home from unwarranted searches and seizures. That was beginning of the country thing. That was sometime around the founding of the Constitution. The next set of amendments we're going to look at are going to be the amendments right after the Civil War, if not maybe one of them during, but I think they were all right after the conclusion of the Civil War. But I expect you to be able to say, oh, these are like Civil War era amendments, that 1860 to 1870 range. Those amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Yes. The 14th Amendment is another one of those gigantic, major amendments that is complicated in its meaning, and a lot of people get super upset about one way or the other. There's even been a small push over the past 3 years or so by some Republicans or more Tea Party people to repeal the 14th Amendment. Clarence Thomas, a member of the Supreme Court, doesn't believe the 14th Amendment to be a legitimate piece of the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment has done a lot to allow for federal government involvement in things. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. The 14th Amendment is due process and equal protection. All persons born or who are U.S. citizens are subject to the same laws. They all get due process. They can't be denied the right to liberty and happiness and life and things like that on the whim. They need to have this due process. They need to have reasons why. There needs to be some standardized system that everybody goes through, and basically laws cannot be applied arbitrarily to either groups of people or to individuals. And that's also, everybody has equal protection under the law. All groups of people and all individuals should get the equal protection or equal rights under the law, depending on how you look at it. Now, if you look at it as equal protection or equal rights, that can lead you to different conclusions as to what that means. And there's a big debate around that also, which to me is extremely fascinating. And also, when you think about my personal political ideology, is kind of infuriating at times, but it's also a conversation for another day. You may have heard, I want to point this out real quick, you may have heard the 14th Amendment being invoked in the debt ceiling standoff. That comes from this sentence: the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for service in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. So when we were looking at that debt ceiling issue, there was some question as to whether or not, if we hit the debt ceiling and we stopped making payments, then that would be unconstitutional. Obama rejected that argument from the beginning. Republicans were very happy he did. A lot of constitutional scholars are not necessarily sure Obama is as, at least, cut and dry right as he says he is on that. He's not going to invoke the 14th Amendment to challenge the Republicans on the debt ceiling. I think a lot of that is political posturing. I'm not sure Obama's that dumb to know that that 14th Amendment argument could be held up in court and could very well be applied to what was going on with the debt ceiling. I think he was being either politically naive, personal opinion here, politically naive, or trying to be overly conciliatory by immediately dismissing that as a sort of weapon in his arsenal to fight the Republicans. He's like, the 14th Amendment provision in fighting you with the debt ceiling is like the bazooka that I have, or it's a nuclear weapon, that I can use to make this never be a thing again. And if I pull it out, like, y'all guys are done. But I'm not going to do that, okay? Let's try and figure something else out. Then for me to have to do this last resort issue that can radically change the way the legislature and the executive work. For all Obama's criticisms, he's a pretty like checks and balances guy. He's let the Congress do a lot, and compared to past presidents, but both Democrat and Republican. Anyway, we'll talk about that a little more, but that's the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment is a right to vote regardless of race, or, as they had to put in there at the time, previously being enslaved. So if you were a slave and you're not anymore, you get to vote. If you never were a slave and you're black, you get to vote. Or if you're any race, you get to vote. So those are the Civil Rights era amendments. You should know that. The next amendments are the Progressive era amendments, 1910 to about 1930-ish. Those are amendments 16, 17, and 19. There are obviously more in there because we skip. But some of the bigger ones. The first one, the 16th Amendment, is the Income Tax Amendment. If anybody tells you that the IRS doesn't have a right to exist, or the government can't actually collect taxes on your income, so don't file your income taxes, they're selling you an insane conspiracy theory, or they hate you a lot and they want to get you put in jail or have your wages garnished. They're just wrong. The government has a right to collect taxes on your income, and it's in the 16th Amendment. That was created, I think 1913, when it looked like we were maybe about to get into war and we needed cash money. The 17th Amendment is, this may surprise some people, an amendment that allowed for the direct election of senators. Before the 17th Amendment, before 1920-ish, the Progressive era, senators were elected by the state legislatures in most states. Now, there were some states that allowed for the direct election of senators by the people, but a lot of states it was the state legislature. So we vote directly for the U.S. House of Representatives, and we also vote directly for people to represent us in the state legislature. In North Carolina, we call it combined the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly then, the people we elected in the General Assembly, they would then turn around and they would be the ones that would vote for the senators and send our 2 U.S. senators to the U.S. Senate. With the 17th Amendment, during the Progressive era, we, the people, got the right to vote for our senators directly. So that's why now we can vote for, in North Carolina, we meaning the majority or plurality of us, voted for Kay Hagan and for Richard Burr to be in the Senate. Whereas if we had lived in before 17th Amendment time, it would have been the folks in Raleigh in the legislature, state legislature, who would be voting for those people for Senate. So that's important. The 19th Amendment is women can vote. Yay! 1919, I think, 1920. Can't exactly remember. One thing to keep in mind is, again, there were some states that allowed women to vote, some states that did not. A lot of the states that allowed women to vote were the western states, and a lot of their reason for allowing women to vote is that they needed to get their population numbers up to be a state. Excuse me. So, like, I think Wyoming. Excuse me. If I remember, it was like If I remember, it was like Wyoming, or maybe Montana. One of those two was like the first state to allow women to vote, to give women the right to vote. Women won the right to vote, however you want to phrase it. That was because in order to be a state, you need to have like 60,000 voting people in it. And without women voting, they wouldn't have had that 60,000. So, hey, women, why don't you come here and we'll give you a right to vote and you can increase our numbers. So that's how that happened. Before this, in like 1917, when we declared war on Germany and got into World War One, there was actually one woman in the House of Representatives at the time. She was the first woman, and she was the only woman at the time. And this was before women got the right to vote nationally. She was the only person to vote against going to war in World War One, which is kind of a hilarious historical stereotype about women. That's my phone. Okay. So we got the beginning, the founding of the nation amendments. We got the Civil War era amendments. We got the Progressive era amendments. Now we're going to be looking at the post-World War II amendments, okay? 3 of those, the 22nd, 24th, and 26th. These are, again, post-World War II and kind of like Great Society to 1970-ish amendments. Can't remember when the last amendment was passed, maybe in the 80s or something. I don't think it was passed in the 90s. I think it was the 80s. And I'm pretty sure it involved payment for representatives. So before, like, House members, this is a little side on the 27th Amendment. If, let's say, we're all a member of the House of Representatives and we decide we all need a pay raise, we can vote ourselves a pay raise, and then we get the next paycheck, we get a pay raise. Yes! The 27th Amendment changes that so that we can still vote that the House of Representatives get a pay raise, but the pay raise doesn't take effect until after the next election. So if we vote ourselves a 50% pay raise, we better win election next year in order to get it. Otherwise, we won't. So, but we're looking at 22nd, 24th, and 26th. So the 22nd Amendment, again, this may surprise people, is limits the president to either it's like 2 terms or 10 years-ish, depending on what exactly happens. Up until 22nd Amendment was passed, presidents could run for a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th term if they wanted to. They could run for as many terms as they wanted to for president. The only reason we had the tradition of only presidents serving 2 terms is because George Washington decided he would not run for a 3rd term because he felt that would be too monarchish. That if he kept running and winning elections, that would be could create the issue where there's a king and blah blah blah. So he resigned, or he declined to run for re-election after a 2nd term, and everybody else since then followed that, except FDR. So hopefully people know Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. He won his presidency in 1932, won it again in 1936, 1940, and 1944 by gigantic majorities. This was the Great Depression and World War II, and that's part of the reason why he kept running and kept getting reelected, because the nation was in an unprecedented crisis during that entire period, that people wanted, and it was generally seen as a good thing, that there was continuity at the executive office. If Franklin Roosevelt couldn't have run, and after couldn't run for election in 1940, right before we went into World War II, but everybody was sort of seeing it go in that direction. That could have been unstable for our country during a particular fragile time. So that's why that was allowed. However, the other side of that is Washington was maybe a little right about running for election multiple times and winning for a bunch of years in a row, leading to having a crap ton of power, in that he, as the president's term goes longer, he gets to appoint more judges, more members of cabinet positions that maybe are not necessarily tied to presidential terms. So judges, for example, when a president appoints them, he appoints them for life, and only death or their resignation, or rarely an impeachment, can remove them from office. So a president generally only gets to appoint, let's say, like a ninth or an eighth of the federal judges that are currently serving right now in the nation. And that's if they serve an 8-year term. Roosevelt was in there he died a couple months into his 4th term, so he was in there for a buttload of years. 9, 12, 13 years thereabouts. He was able to appoint like half of the federal judgeship. And so he had a lot of political allies everywhere. It meant that his agenda became increasingly secure, and people after he died, and that was sad, and as they reflected thought maybe it's a good idea to limit presidents to 2 terms because they have a lot of power and it can help limit their power some. So the 22nd Amendment came about, limits the president to 2 terms. However, if a president dies basically a little like halfway in his term and the vice president takes over and the vice president serves the remaining 2 years of the original president's term, that person, that vice president who served those previous 2 years as president, can run for re-election 2 more times. So you can run for re-election after the 2 years, and then 4 years later he can run for re-election again, so he can get 10 years in office. It's really sad when it's always sad when a president dies, but it's really sad for a person if a president dies, let's say a year and a half or a year into his term. That person, the vice president, when he becomes president, can only run for re-election once because he's served out the majority of the first president's term. So let's say he gets 2.5 years as president under the first term. He can run for re-election next time the presidential election is, serves 4 years, and then he can't run for re-election again. And that guy gets 6 years or 6.5 years to be president in his life when he could have had 8. Poor him or her. So, yeah, that's that. The 24th Amendment ended poll taxes. Yes. So poll taxes, they actually finally got abolished in North Dakota this past election also, and the state constitution, and just barely. There's one state that didn't abolish their poll tax, even though they don't have one because you can't anymore. But a poll tax was a fee people paid to vote, and this is how the poll tax worked. I would come up, they would look at my voter ID, say card, voter card, voter registration card, or look up my name, Robert Eldridge. They find me in the system, and they look up, they check what color this was, and then they say go vote. They, if someone else came up, they said their name, they looked it up, and they found them in the voter roll, and then, this is sad, but then they said, oh, the color of your skin is that. They then said, all right, give me $15 to vote. That's basically how that worked. And the person with black skin said, why'd you just let that other person go with white skin and no money? It's like rules changed all of a sudden. It was a way to keep black people from voting, and it finally ended the poll tax. So yeah, the other part of that could also happen that maybe in some places didn't necessarily have to be as explicit as what's the color of this, was here's $50, now you get your voter registration card. It would cost money to register to vote. And that's why a lot of these voter ID laws are being challenged, is because, well, partly because they are blatant attempts to suppress minority vote. Listen, that's uncontroversial they're blatant attempts by Republicans to suppress Democratic votes. That's what they are, pure and simple. So that's a fact. But one of the ways they're being challenged is this poll tax, or this idea, because even if we grant people, like if you need a photo ID, even if we give people free photo IDs, that doesn't mean the photo ID is necessarily really free, because a lot of times people may not have their birth certificate on them to prove who they are, or their social security card, or some other form of ID. They may need to pay the hospital they were born at, or the county department they were born, or the county department they were born, the county they were born in. Pay them money to get a copy of their birth certificate. They may need to pay somebody else to get a copy of some other record so they can prove who they are, so then they can get that free ID, so then they can get that free voter registration card. So the question is, and part of this, is it a poll tax if you just have to hand the person money just for the voter registration card, or if you have to pay money at any point along the process as a rule to get a voter registration card? Does that count as a poll tax? It's a good question, up for debate. So that's one of those, like 1965-ish or so. Just know it's post-World War II amendment, Civil Rights era amendment. The 26th Amendment, 18-year-olds get to vote. Yay! Before the 26th Amendment, only 21 and older got to vote. 18-year-olds, you can now say that, oh, I'm old enough to vote, but I can't drink beer. That thing, because that never gets old. So keep saying that, because that's great. And totally a valid argument. You're really smart. And I'm so glad that you can vote. So have fun voting. And I hope you enjoyed this very lengthy review. Went over a lot of stuff. I'm not going to, like I said, hit everything next week. I'll put a lot of it or most of it in a email I'm about to write you. But this video will also help and provide, hopefully, some cool background info. So yeah. Political ideology paper, 10 days from now, thereabouts. Email me. Questions, concerns, anything like that. There's a video on the political ideology paper, which is a little longer because it also gives some background on what looking for, but never be afraid to ask anything at all. I hope y'all have a good Martin Luther King weekend. The I Have a Dream speech is amazing. You should watch that on YouTube. Letter from a Birmingham jail is exquisite. So yeah, and some of his later stuff too. I think people maybe would be interested to read some of the stuff he wrote and said the year and 2 years before he was assassinated. We start looking at less civil rights stuff, depending on how you look at civil rights, and he starts getting into opposing the Vietnam War and supporting workers' rights to unionize, and supporting poverty programs. Supporting poverty. Supporting the creation of social safety net programs, anti-poverty programs, things like that. Those are also very good and very interesting. So enjoy the weekend, and I can't wait to see all of y'all on Wednesday, bright and early. Peace out.